You know, it's amazing, isn't it, when without ever having the conversation, the music, the poem from Naomi Shahid Nye, that's a favorite of mine, line up so perfectly this morning with what I want to try to say to you today. So thank you, Carissa, for your beautiful music and the thought behind them. And thank you all for having me back. So I'm trying to decide whether it's that you resonate with what I've said before, or you're just still giving me a chance and trying to let me make amends. But it is always a pleasure. This is the third time I've been with you now, and it's a special challenge for me to think through a teaching for this incredibly eclectic gathering of people here that is C3. So thank you. Maybe you've heard enough already about the presidential elections. Maybe like me, you're ready to sort of enter a bubble of silence that could extend for 4 years. Or maybe you're ready to scream, to protest, to complain about the unfairness of the electoral college system, or maybe you breathed a sigh of relief because your candidate won. Although I suspect that that's not the prominent mindset of this community. So I was with friends Roger and Joanne Martin. Where are you? Here we are, Roger and Joanne Martin for lunch just a little over a week ago, and I asked them if I should be talking about the election this morning, and Joanne said you could bring a new perspective on the election. And so that's what I want to try to do this morning in honor of Joanne. The question I want to explore this morning is, what does faith teach us for times such as this? Before I even go any further, for those of you whose teeth are set on edge when I even say the word faith, let me define what I mean. By faith, I mean not a set of religious practices, a doctrine, a creedal statement. I certainly don't mean that longing for the sweet by and by when we meet on the beautiful shore. But rather, faith is that transcendent quality that motivates us to live lives rooted in justice and mercy. Faith is a willingness to live in hope no matter the despair that surrounds us. Faith is the belief that we're part of something that's larger than ourselves, even though we may not have the language to describe that other. Faith is a state of mind that causes us to act ethically in society. Our daughter Dawn texted me early on the day of the election saying that her boys were sobbing as they learned the results, and didn't I have some wisdom to offer? The first thing that came to my mind was a quote from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it tends toward justice. Now, that may not be comforting to a 12-year-old and a 17-year-old, but it's where I want to start today in trying to answer the question for myself: what does faith teach us for times such as this? The arc of the moral universe. Since I was a child, I have attempted to understand my place in this borderless, eternally expanding, incomprehensibly immense universe with a very simplistic analogy. The universe is a reservoir like a massive impoundment of water. But instead of rain or snow melt, it fills with goodness. When I speak with kindness, a little goodness gets added to the reservoir. When I act out of tender feelings, the level of the reservoir rises. The reservoir deepens with each word and with each act from every living person. I also understand my simple little analogy in the converse when I speak harshly to another. When I act selfishly, a little goodness is taken out of the reservoir and the levels drop. The goal in life is to fill the reservoir with goodness. If in my life I have added more than I've subtracted, then my purpose for being will have been somehow fulfilled. Faith teaches me that the universe is more than the sum of its physical attributes. The universe is infused with meaning. It is the very source from which we draw our intellect, our consciousness, our fellow feeling, our ability to love another. If we're moral people, then it must be that the wellspring of that morality is nothing other than the universe itself, poured into us through a long evolutionary process, nurtured in us by being loved at our mother's breast, held in our father's arms, and then in turn loving another. We live in a moral universe that shapes us and that we shape. But the arc of the moral universe is long, and that's where we start to have trouble. We're impatient. Maybe that's our human nature. Maybe it's our Western world view. Maybe it's arrogance. Whatever. We want what we want, and we want it now. We think in dog years. We live as if there's no tomorrow. Self-gratification comes instantly with Facebook and Twitter. Self-actualization is learned in 3 easy online courses, and then we can move on to something else. But the arc of the moral universe is long. Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, Jesuit philosopher, theologian, botanist from the latter part of the 19th and early part of the 20th centuries, had much to say and had a much more sophisticated take on my reservoir model. Maybe if I had read Teilhard when I was 6 instead of 66, I'd have a more complex understanding of the universe. But Teilhard thought in evolutionary time. He proposed the theory that in the evolution of biological life, a physical process occurred that introduced consciousness in human beings. A transformation occurred within the biosphere that introduced what Teilhard called the noosphere. And within this noosphere, consciousness evolved through the simple, from a simple point of self-awareness through ideation and to complex thought and emotion. And further, Teilhard held that evolution of consciousness, which continues, is continuous, that it has an ethical goal. And that goal is the unity of all creation, animate and inanimate, in a single point of perfection. Or as a young and idealistic Georgie saw it, the reservoir is finally filled and it begins to overflow. That point of perfection, Teilhard calls it the omega point, is also the physical union of all that exists with the spiritual nature or the ethical nature of the universe. Martin Luther King understood that when he said the arc of the moral universe is long, but it tends toward justice. That's the first thing that faith teaches. Less than 48 hours after the election results were announced, I attended a symposium on immigration at Grand Valley State University. The symposium had been planned for months, of course, but its timing could not have been more prescient or powerful. Emotions were raw, and the tears flowed freely as the panelists, a panel consisting of immigrants and advocates for immigrants, as the panelists told their stories and laid bare their feelings and expressed their fears. Then the panel discussion was followed by by table talk. I was the only straight, white, native-born male at my table, the only one who had little to fear from this president-elect, with respect at least to my own safety. As I listened to my table mates from Mexico and the Middle East, at least 4 of whom are gay, I found myself asking the question, what will I do? What will I do? What will I do when they start rounding up undocumented immigrants, setting up camps to hold them pending deportation? What will I do when angry crowds take to the streets, firebombing mosques and Muslim-owned businesses, pulling people out of their homes and beating them? Could this happen in America? Well, it's already begun. In a hallway conversation with at the symposium with Bing Goy, the director of the Michigan Department of Immigration, I learned from Bing that he had been inundated in the previous 24 hours with phone calls from all over the state of Michigan, describing attacks on Muslims and school children marching through the halls, chanting, "Build the wall, build the wall." I left the symposium at the Eberhard Center and I was walking to my car when a pickup truck roared by way too fast, with young men hanging out the windows, waving Trump signs and shouting. Was it anger I felt, or was it fear, or was it simply a deep despair? Faith teaches me I must not abandon hope. I may despair for a season, I may weep, I may be afraid, but I must not abandon hope. I've long understood that there's a difference between hope and optimism. Today I am not optimistic. Today I expect the worst. But because I am hopeful, I will not wait for the worst to happen, but I will live as if the best is imminent. Pour my little ladles of goodness, my spoons full, as fast as I can into the reservoir. Now, what does that mean? It means that I will love deeply. It means I will speak boldly. It means I will align myself with those who are living on the margins of society, those most vulnerable, those living in fear. It means I will be wiser than those who would oppress and smarter than those who devise the systems of oppression. Kinder than those who would hurt others. More generous, more compassionate, more just. It means I will sometimes have to act against my nature, which is protective and insular. Faith teaches me that I must be humble, but that does not mean that I must be meek in the face of enormous immorality. Being humble means hearing the stories of others and not assuming that my story is normative. And it means following when my nature might be to lead. Yes, faith teaches that I must not abandon hope. It also teaches that I must be good and wise and humble. Rabbi Heschel wrote, we live by the conviction that acts of goodness reflect the hidden light of God's holiness. God's light is above our minds, but not beyond our will. It is within our power to mirror God's unending love in deeds of kindness like brooks that hold the sky. In a moral universe that bends toward a far horizon of justice, I cannot clearly see the path that leads us to that horizon. And like Moses on Mount Nebo, I know that I will not see the end, the culmination of goodness, but faith teaches me to live in that hope. In fact, faith teaches me to live as if that distant horizon were my present reality. Not blind to all the evil that's around me, but doing all that I can in my own life to manifest goodness. The prophet Isaiah spoke of a world where wild and domesticated animals live in peace together, where a little child will lead us. Jesus spoke of the reign of God. Both urged followers to live in the reality of that future promise. Faith teaches me to live in hope. There's a third lesson from faith that I hesitated before dealing with it. I fear this lesson. The first lesson teaches me to be patient and good as the long arc of history, evolutionary history, unfolds. The second lesson encourages hope in the presence of despair. I can follow those two lessons. The third lesson is this: to be authentically human, we must suffer with those who suffer. The notion of suffering with is deeply embedded in the Abrahamic faith traditions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, the three traditions that I know best. And I would be very surprised if it isn't found extensively in other non-Abrahamic traditions. Levitical law is very clear about the obligation of the Jew to the widow, the orphan, the refugee. The Hebrew prophets mince no words in setting forth an ethic of obligation that involves personal sacrifice on the part of those who are wealthy and powerful. Jesus was bold in his expectations of his followers to take up the cross, and he was crystal clear in defining that action of taking up the cross as sacrificing personal comfort for the benefit of those who are suffering. The Apostle James wrote, if you suffer for doing what is right, you are blessed. And the prophet Muhammad wrote, O you who have attained to faith, be ever steadfast in upholding equity, bearing witness to the truth. Do not then follow your own desires, lest you swerve from justice. So what does it mean to suffer with? The beautiful words of the poet Naomi Shahid Nye that were read speak so powerfully to that. First, it means to have deep compassion, to see the plight of the poor, to see the plight of the planet, and to be moved deeply in your heart to empathy. Pope Francis wrote in his encyclical on climate change, a sense of deep communion with the rest of nature cannot be real if our heart lacks tenderness, compassion, and concern for our fellow human beings. Suffering with is a condition of the heart. A young man approached me Monday following an event at the Grand Rapids Public Library, and he told me that he is an undocumented Mexican refugee. He said that several years ago, when he was a teenager, his family, living in daily fear of deportation, his mother had taken him to a pro-immigration rally at which I had spoken. It means so much to me to know that there are people like you who stand with us. I don't feel so much alone and so afraid. Faith teaches me that my heart must break with tenderness and my eyes fill with tears when I confront injustice toward and suffering of the stranger in your midst, as Scripture calls the immigrant. But the heart moved to tender compassion for those who suffer is not enough. Compassion must lead to action. Surely there were people in Europe who felt compassion for the Jews under the Nazi oppression. But a few, moved by that tender compassion, acted against their own self-interests, against their own personal safety, and they harbored Jews in their homes, in secret places, behind hidden doors. Surely there were people in positions of power in Latin America who were moved to tears over the plight of the campesinos. But a small group of priests of the Liberation School of Theology, knowing the risks they were taking in organizing worker communities and speaking out publicly against their oppressors, still acted beyond the tears, because of the tears. During this past week and a half, we've heard stories of Muslims beaten on American streets, of black dolls lynched on college campuses, lines painted across high school corridors with no Mexicans beyond this point, swastikas sprayed on garage doors and places of business. Hate has seized this moment. But to quote a campaign slogan, love trumps hate. Love trumps hate. The question for us today is, how do we express that love? Will we love with more than our tears? Will we love beyond our fears? To what end our tender compassion? Faith teaches us that we must act. In the face of great evil, we must speak out. As others are displaced, we must ourselves decide what level of personal displacement love calls us to. I don't have answers for myself, much less for you. But I know that faith teaches that each of us must wrestle with the question and act in ways that are appropriate to our circumstances, thoughtfully and always boldly. You are a remarkable collection of people. You're diverse in thought and background. You are intellectually curious and open-minded. Were one to start out in search of progressive America, one might very well start right here. The more I know you, the more I respect your counter-cultural nature. Indeed, C3 exists over against the very evils of exclusion, intolerance, anti-intellectualism, and hatred that threaten the America that we know and that we love today. Because of whom you are, much is expected of you. When the voice of narrow-mindedness is heard in the land, I will listen for your counter voice. When faceless systems grind the poor and round up the powerless, I will feel your love move over the land with mercy, comforting those who suffer. When power seeks to hurt and oppress, I will look for you among the few who stand on the ramparts. And when the time of evil has passed, when the omega point has come, when the reservoir is full, I will join you in the great celebration. For goodness will prevail, and justice will fill the earth. Thank you for listening.